What is Christmas about? Well, we heard Matthias, Aidan, and Kian read the story of Jesus' birth from the Gospel of Luke. And you may know that the Gospel of Matthew tells a slightly different story involving some additional characters, like those three wise people who walked toward a star in the east, bringing some gifts with them. And Mark's Gospel says nothing. John's says nothing except this, and the Word became flesh and lived among them. And that's the story I want to fill in. Why did God do that? Why did God become flesh, human, to live among us? Well, here's a little story that might help explain. So one Christmas Eve, Samantha, looked out the window at the snow swirling down and listened to the frosty wind whistle through the cracks in the window pane. She was home alone. Her family was at church for Christmas Eve service, but as usual, Sam chose not to go for many reasons, and no reason really in particular. It's just that church wasn't her thing. She's sitting there looking through the window, and suddenly she realized, oh my goodness, the barn! I forgot all about the animals. What is wrong with me? And she quickly put on her boots and coat and opened the back door to a blast of frigid air. She walked carefully down the icy steps and went across the yard, pulled on that big wooden door and had it creak open and walked inside. And it was almost as cold inside as it was out. Her breath hung in white clouds in front of her. She struck a match and began lighting heaters and stood around one of them, warming her hands, rubbing them together. And the animals welcomed the warmth and light too. Sam fed them, and soon they were warm and full. And Sam walked back outside. And as she did, snowflakes danced around her head, and she remembered when she was a girl and run around trying to catch the snow on her tongue. And she thought maybe she should try that again. And then she thought Mrs. Crowder down the road might see her and have some juicy news for the next day. Oof, it was cold. It was so cold the snow crunched under her feet. She looked up and noticed some sparrows perched on the bare limbs of a pear tree in the yard. The bitter wind was ruffling their feathers, and they seemed almost frozen to the limb. In fact, some of them had fallen to the ground and were kind of flopping around. Poor little sparrows, she said out loud. Sam knew that without shelter, they might soon freeze to death. So she tried again and again to shoo them toward the barn. But as she moved toward them, they flopped away. They were afraid of this giant creature. They didn't understand she was only trying to help them. Frustrated, she thought, if only I could become a sparrow, I could help them, because they could follow me and they wouldn't be afraid. And just then she heard in the distance the ring of the church bell off the steeple. It's midnight. It's Christmas. She stood up to listen, and then she had an idea. She got a sack of seed from the barn and threw some onto the snow, and slowly, one sparrow after another moved toward the seed and began to eat. And Sam made a path of that seed that led them right into the barn. She closed the big wooden door and looked through a crack. The birds were frightened and confused at first, but soon they flew up to the barn rafters and perched there, safe and warm. And Samantha smiled. Now, one of the ways Sam thought she could help the sparrows was by becoming one of them. And you know, in a very simple way, that's the idea of Christmas. In fact, the angels kept saying to Mary, to the shepherds, to everyone, do not fear, don't be afraid. God is becoming one of us to save us and show us a better way of life, a life of service and generosity and kindness and sacrificial love. It's that life that Jesus lived and taught. The Word became flesh and lived among us to show us the way of justice and compassion, and not merely for ourselves, for that wouldn't be very Christ-like, but Christ came to dwell among us and families at the border, and the mass incarcerated and the wrongly imprisoned, with those on death row tonight and in COVID wards alone. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us for them and us, to show us compassion that we might be compassion. What's Christmas about? That's what Christmas is about. And that's what will bring us all a Merry Christmas.